Okay, I see lots of people coming on at exactly 4 o'clock. It's nice to see everybody. It's really terrific to have everyone coming in and joining us for this webinar series on migration. I'm really pleased to be here to introduce this panel on behalf of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at UWM. This weekly webinar series on migration is jointly sponsored by UWM's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, as well as UW-Madison's Latin American program. We are very thankful for the partnership, and my thanks go to M, who's provided us with a terrific logistics on this, as well as Kata, Belin, and Alberto. This is definitely a collective effort. There are lots of folks who've been involved with helping to make this come to reality. Both of our campuses had wonderful plans to invite our panelists who are here today in person here in Milwaukee. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do it because of COVID, but we're able to bring in so many people remotely. And on a day like today, where there's a lot of excitement and perhaps a little nervousness, you know, maybe the benefit of having tuned into this program today is that we can maybe step away from a little bit of the US politics and learn something new about South to South migration. So I appreciate everyone being with us today. I would like just to thank everyone for coming, and also acknowledge that this series is sponsored through the Title VI grant from the Department of Ed as National Resource Centers. Part of what we do is to engage with the public and scholars on Latin American topics, and so we're happy to do so with this series. Our panel on South to South migration is going to be moderated by Professor Ann Dressel from the School of Nursing here at UWM. Ann is serving double duty as both a panelist and a moderator. So I will turn it over to Ann, who will introduce herself as well as the other panelists. And I thank everyone again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Yes, so I'm Ann Dressel. I am an assistant professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I also serve as director of our Center for Global Health Equity. And I'm going to introduce our other panelists right away. We also have Professor Megan Sheehan, and she's an assistant professor of sociology at the College of St. Benedict at St. John's University. And then we also have Professor Cristian Doña Reveco. He is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology and director of the Office of Latino Latin American Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. So we're really pleased that all of you have joined us today. We're each going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes speaking, and then we'll have plenty of time, at least half an hour, for questions at the end. And I would ask that you put your questions in chat as you think of them, and then at the end we'll go through and respond to your questions. So I am the first presenter, and I am going to now share my screen. And I will be talking today about attitudes toward immigrants and refugees in Ecuador. And I really want to thank the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, as well as the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for hosting this series. So very briefly, I'm going to be talking a little bit about human rights at the beginning of my talk, and then we'll go into a little information about Ecuador, the background to the study, about the research study itself, and of course, given the times we're living in, a little bit about COVID-19 and how that's affecting Ecuador and refugees and immigrants living there. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if it's new to you, I would encourage you to take a look at it. There's a link here, or you can certainly Google it. It was created after World War II in 1948, and Eleanor Roosevelt actually chaired the UN committee that drafted the document which was adopted by the UN General Assembly. And it's very relevant and important as we think about refugees and migration and vulnerable populations. And you can see here in the preamble that all are entitled to equal and inalienable rights. And that's articulated in 30 articles in this Universal Declaration, including Article 14, which is everyone has a right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. I also want to mention the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So these were launched in 2015. They're a follow-up from the UN Millennium Development Goals, which rolled out at the turn of the millennium. And there are 17 goals to be met by the year 2030 with specific measurable targets and indicators. A lot of these goals are very relevant to immigration and immigrants and refugees. And for example, goal 8 has to do with decent work and economic growth and has specific targets and indicators related to migrant workers, human trafficking, and slavery. And goal number 17 is also very important to our discussion about partnerships for sustainable development. It specifically calls for enhancing South-South cooperation and capacity building. And how can countries in South America, for example, work together to address migration flows and services for immigrants and refugees? So a little bit of background information about Ecuador. It sits on the equator, which is where its name comes from, and it's slightly smaller than the state of Nevada geographically. And it has several distinct regions. First of all, the coastal zone, which is the second most populous area. The Andes, the mountains run north to south through the country, and more than half the population lives in that part of the country. And then the Amazon basin, which is very sparsely populated, and the Galapagos Islands are also part of Ecuador. It's got a population of around 17 million, and Quito is the capital city located up in the Andes with a population of about 2.2 million. And Guayaquil is the largest city on the coast with about 2.35 million people. It's got a democratic government, and its economy is heavily dependent on petroleum. About a third of the economy is. So changes in the global price of oil has a big impact on the economy of Ecuador, and obviously services that they can provide to their own citizens as well as immigrants and refugees. You can see the GDP per capita on the slide, how it compares to the US. These are pre-COVID-19 numbers. And the dollarization of the economy is also some important background information. In the year 2000, Ecuador adopted the US dollar as its official currency, which has implications for migrants and refugees wanting to come and work in Ecuador. Ecuador has the most refugees and asylum seekers of any country in Latin America. And again, the numbers on this slide are pre-COVID-19, but officially Ecuador has 60,000 refugees with about 95% of those from Colombia. Actual estimates, though, are that there's about 450,000 people from Colombia living in Ecuador, as well as 547,000 from Venezuela, which has been overwhelming the country. Ecuador adopted an open borders policy in 2008. And so this policy eliminated visa requirements for citizens from any country who wish to stay in Ecuador for up to 90 days. They amended that in 2010 and put some restrictions on for people coming from countries that had a high incidence of irregular migration like Bangladesh, Nepal. Ecuador also passed the Human Mobility Act law in 2017, which regularizes the status of immigrants, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, and victims of trafficking and human smuggling, as well as their families, and favors their full integration. A little more background information about this study is, first of all, the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees says that migration flows in South America is an area of study that's under-researched. And relatedly, much of the research that focuses on how immigrants and refugees impact receiving countries is focused on the global north, so there's a gap in the literature. And the current study I'll be talking about builds on these, a previous study, and I've got a couple citations on this slide here, that Professor Michelle Shedlin had done with her team with Colombian refugees in Ecuador. And one of the big findings was food insecurity is an issue for them, and that's an area I'm interested in, which is how I got hooked in with this group and interested in this study. So we did a qualitative study in 2017, which followed up in this previous work that Professor Shedlin and her team had done. And the aim of this qualitative study was to explore attitudes toward immigrants and refugees living in Quito, Ecuador, among the different sectors that interact with them. We employed a transnationalism framework, which considers the socio-political and cultural context, which we need to be taking into account as we're thinking about the health and well-being of immigrants and refugees. I worked with Professor Shedlin and her team at FUNSAD, which English is the Health, Environment, and Development Foundation, which is located in Quito, Ecuador, to develop this follow-up study. And we conducted individual interviews with 50 adults working in Quito who work in sectors that serve or interact with refugees and migrants about their attitudes toward refugees and immigrants living in Ecuador. So we interviewed 10 people from each of the following sectors: from education, from healthcare, from non-governmental organizations, from the press and the police. The interviews were conducted in Spanish. They were audio taped, transcribed, coded, and analyzed in Spanish to identify emergent themes. And I also want a quick mention about terminology. Participants would often use the words immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers. Everybody often got lumped under the term migrantes, migrants. So the terminology is a little loose, even though there are, we know, formal definitions for what it means to be a refugee or an asylum seeker. So some results from our study, you can see the demographic information of our participants. They ranged in age from 19 to 84 years old. 59% were male, 41% were female, and more than half, 55%, identified themselves as politically liberal or left of center. Our qualitative analysis yielded 4 overarching themes, looking at the health and well-being of migrants, discrimination and bias, a willingness to help them, but within limits, and then the influence of social policies. And we'll be looking at some examples of each. So participants noted that displacement can impact the mental health of migrants and their families and be a significant source of stress. And you can see some of the quotes here on the slide. I'm worried about mental health, what it means to become displaced without it really being your life choice, but you have to do it, oftentimes to save your life, to save the life of your children. And participants also noted that malnutrition and food insecurity were concerns, which is a finding that Professor Shedlin had found, obviously, in her previous study. And you can see the quote here: if some migrant families do not have enough resources, there's malnutrition. Colombian women living in Ecuador often face stigma related to stereotypes about engaging in transactional sex. And participants in our study reiterated this bias, even though it's not a verifiable major practice. And you can see some of the example quotes here. Many women engage in sex work while they establish themselves. Their partner establishes themselves, including cases I've heard where their partner, their own husband, sends them to prostitute themselves so that they can stabilize themselves economically and survive. You know what I mean? These are hard times. Another participant said, these beautiful Colombian women are very stigmatized as prostitutes, closely linked to sex work. This generates a lot of opposition from the Ecuadorian population. And yes, there is discrimination against Colombian and Venezuelan women. If they have that kind of thinking, it's because of the reputation they have given themselves, that they are easy girls that come here just for money, so they will do anything. All participants from all sectors expressed concerns about discrimination and bias against migrants, and participants sometimes blamed other sectors for perpetuating stereotypes. You can see in the top quote at the end of it there, it says the media can often be very xenophobic. And a healthcare professional said, I believe that discrimination is mostly cultural because it is like we feel threatened with the culture that they, the migrants, bring with them. We suddenly feel threatened, and the first reaction is to defend ourselves. And another participant said, the middle class creates stereotypes of crime, and the problem is that the middle class has an impact on the media. So the media reproduces the fears and vision of the middle class, and in this way, a social imagery is constructed of the, quote, Colombian criminal or drug trafficker, unquote, or the Colombian prostitute. These stereotypes are built from the fears of the middle class and transfer to the media. Perceptions about migrants shape participants' willingness to help them. They recognize the vulnerability of migrants, but also express concerns about them exhausting social services such as healthcare, which could limit access for Ecuadorians. And you can see the quotes on the slide here. I'm very concerned about the use of healthcare services. In any given day, 25 to 35% of our health consultations or emergency health services are for migrants. It is an investment and they need it, but how are we going to recover those costs? We don't have resources for our own population. How can we solve that? And another participant said, migrants saturate our services and demand our first level services, and that creates competition with our population. Participants, however, also noted that migrants are a vulnerable population and they exhibited sensitivity to their situation. They said, they are a vulnerable group per their status as refugees, their very status, their economic situation, their social and family situation. In the bottom quote here, there are good people. I've met people who have come, who have sweated and toiled, trying to get out of a situation that they were not looking for. I do not think anyone wants to migrate. They migrate because their conditions are super adverse. All health sector participants noted that migrants in Ecuador had access to healthcare because it's a human right. The right to healthcare is guaranteed in Ecuador's constitution and espoused by the World Health Organization, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and influence participants' responses. And you can see the quotes here. According to international guidelines, a refugee has a right to receive medical attention like any Ecuadorian. And as a health professional, we have a moral and ethical obligation to give them medical attention. And the Ministry of Health is under obligation. It is our responsibility to care for all vulnerable groups. The influence of social policies was noted in many participants' responses across all sectors. And as previously mentioned, the right to healthcare is enshrined in Ecuador's constitution, which guarantees additional rights. For example, participants said, constitutionally, we have the duty and obligation to guard the physical and mental health of all, not only of the Ecuadorians by birth, but also of all the inhabitants, of all the people who live in our country. And per the Constitution, the government, the state has to guarantee attention to all people within Ecuadorian territory. Participants noted, however, that there were challenges with laws guaranteed in the Constitution. And you can see the bottom quote on the slide. Ecuador is a country that has fantastic laws, but I think that in practice there are still barriers. It's still not enough. I think there is a gap. Responses were also influenced by Ecuador's open borders policy. For example, one participant said, we should have an open border policy because we ourselves are a country that has also migrated in many moments of history for many reasons. It is a bit illogical that having all of this history and all of this experience of migration, that we cannot be a country that receives migrants. And you can see someone else said, Ecuador should open its doors, but logically to do this, we first have to educate ourselves as Ecuadorians and generate adequate infrastructure. And some question the policy altogether, as the bottom quote says, I've experienced in several areas, and I have friends throughout the country always tell me that they do not agree with the borders having been open, and that there, the migrants' visas or passport is not required. Respondents identified dollarization of the economy, which again refers to Ecuador's adoption of the US dollar as its currency, as a factor that contributed to migration to Ecuador. Some respondents felt the opportunity to earn US dollars allowed migrants to use Ecuador as a trampoline. That is, migrants would come to Ecuador to earn and save US dollars and then jump to another location in South America or the US, for example. And you can see the quotes on the slide. What you see is a trampoline. So if I, as a migrant, come here to Ecuador, my purpose is then to move to the US. Or on the bottom, we have dollarization, and that is one of the main reasons why the majority of Latin American citizens come here. Ecuador is the only country in South America that has a dollar. That is an important economic opportunity. And I want to note that attitudes might be changing since we collected this data in 2017. As many of you know, there's been an overwhelming influx of migrants from Venezuela in recent years. And to respond to that, Ecuador created a special humanitarian visa in 2019 to regularize Venezuelans who are already in the country. And specific to Venezuelans, the 2018 Quito Declaration, which involved 11 countries, including Ecuador and Chile, who we'll be hearing about in a moment, affirmed Latin America's commitment to improving migrants' access to regular status, health services, skills training, and the labor market. And signatories agreed to accept expired travel documents and to create an information card for regional mobility so Venezuelans could easily migrate and integrate. And I want to wrap this up just saying a few things about COVID-19. Of course, the pandemic may have impacted attitudes towards immigrants and refugees. And Ecuador was hit really hard early on in the pandemic. Some of you may have read stories or seen photos. There were dead bodies lining the streets of Guayaquil. And many Venezuelans have decided to head back to Venezuela since there was such a horrible outbreak in Ecuador. And you've probably read there's camps now on the border of Venezuelans trying to return, the border between Colombia and Venezuela. So it'd be interesting to interview people again to see if attitudes towards immigrants and refugees have changed and in what ways since we collected this data. So I want to thank you. If you'd like more information, I've got a citation here of an article that's hot off the press. It came out this year in Public Health Nursing that summarizes this study. And feel free to drop me an email, put notes, questions in the chat. We'll get to those at the end of our presentations. And I also have a link on here to the UW Center for Global Health Equity. We offer a short-term global health study abroad program to Ecuador that all of you are welcome to participate in. So thank you very much. I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Sheehan.
Hi, thank you. I will share my screen. Okay. I am very excited to be with you all today and to share a little bit about my research. Thank you for this kind invitation. I'm going to be talking specifically about urban encounters in Santiago, Chile. My work explores and examines Latin American migration to Chile, and I'm really interested in the ways in which migrants are involved in some of the unfolding urban changes happening in the city. Chile is very centralized, and Santiago accounts for nearly 40% of the national population. And in a kind of similar vein, the metro region really dominates the country's economic, educational, and social spheres. Over the last kind of 30 years, the metro area has grown by about 67%. And there's been an expansion both of peripheral urban areas as well as a densification of the central municipality areas and some of the kind of outlying areas that are along metro lines. I'm working on a paper on verticalization, so you'll note that a lot of this is drawn on research conducted about migrant use of high-rise housing, which you can see in this photo of Santiago. This is from the kind of one of the central hills and shows a little bit of the central development in the city. So my interests really include examining urban space within two kind of frameworks or paradigms. I'm interested in how sites are used, the experience of urban spaces, and how migrants are using these spaces. But then I'm also interested, which a connection to Anne's work, in the ways that spaces are perceived and understood, how they become associated with migration, and this idea of representational space. Today, I'm gonna focus a little bit more on the experience of space, but I'm happy to talk more about the spatial perceptions in Q&A. So in this framework, I'm kind of really interested in the kind of production, the fluidity of what we think of as enclaves, the ways that clustered, the mechanisms that kind of impact how clustered settlement patterns play out, the ways that migrants are funneled into certain housing arrangements, and then how these pattern. And then finally, I'm also interested in the kind of implications of some of these really dynamic and it seems like continually changing migratory flows. And some of these include the increasing verticality and density in which migrants are finding certain areas that they're kind of engaging or living in clustered settlements within high rises. The other thing that I really explore in some other pieces is the use of public space. And I'm increasingly interested in migrant engagement in neighborhood centers and hope to continue to do some research on that topic. I am an anthropologist, and so I do ethnographic research and use ethnographic methods. This has a lot on it. I've been working in Chile for a number of years. I did kind of long-term fieldwork for my dissertation in 2012 and 2013. Before that, I had lived and worked on the border in Arica. The research I'm drawing on today is entirely from my last period of fieldwork, which was May through August of 2019. And it was observational in public spaces and residences, some go-alongs. There are a number of public lectures that were particularly helpful for my work. And then today I'm going to be drawing on primarily the interviews with Venezuelan migrants, which was a significant change in that last period of fieldwork from earlier periods of fieldwork. So we'll be largely emphasizing Venezuelan migration. Just a very brief background on migration to Chile, because I know Christian will go over this in much more detail and policy oriented. But there's been an incredible growth in the migrant population in Chile, starting from the kind of return to democracy. Chile's strong economy was one reason driving that. Initially, it was often Peruvian migrant flows, and at the beginning, kind of Peruvian women were the kind of primary drivers of those flows. Over time, it's become more diverse, kind of in the early 2000s. There's been significant flows from Colombia, Bolivia, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, among other nations, including Ecuador, actually. Each of these flows is incredibly, has a number of really diverse reasons, a number of different push and pull factors, and importantly, migrant experiences among different populations and within different national populations in Chile are often quite distinct. So with that caveat, I'm definitely focusing on Venezuelan migration, which has been kind of quite different from some of the other earlier migratory patterns. The last 4 to 5 years, there's been an incredible influx of Venezuelan migrants. In 2012, about the migrant population accounted for about 2.3% of the total population in Chile. So 2.3% were foreign born, and by 2019, it's almost 8%. So there's been a kind of incredible impact of migrant communities. And then this is just to highlight some of the kind of increasingly diverse communities that are present in Chile, including the kind of very recent Venezuelan migration. For the purposes of this talk, one of the kind of most important points is that the different migrant communities are really settling in different areas and and kind of have very specific settlement patterns, often because people are finding initial housing and then subsequent housing through social networks. 2/3 of all the migrants in Chile live, or approximately 2/3, live in the Santiago metro area. And this is a map of the different municipalities in Santiago. My research has been focusing primarily in the central municipality of Santiago, where migrants account for 21% of the municipal population. Data today, I also present a case study of a group of migrants living in Estación Central, which is still central, but just slightly towards the west. One other thing about this. So migrant settlement is playing out alongside Santiago's own rapid urban change. Santiago has been increasing its own population. One other thing to note is that there's about 500,000. Santiago itself has Santiago and the kind of surrounding ex-urban areas are about 6 million, a little bit under 6 million, and it has a housing deficit of at least 500,000. So I also, when I was doing research the last fieldwork season, I interviewed with the help of a Chilean research assistant, invaluable Chilean research assistant, several directors of the Junta de Vecinos or neighborhood councils, and they had really interesting insights. All were based in the the municipalities of Santiago, and they had some really interesting insights into the changes that they were seeing in their sectors. And in conversations with these directors of neighborhood councils, the discussions of pattern differences in housing were quite common. And just as a quick note, all the names are pseudonyms and all the translations are my own here. So when asked about what housing was like for migrants living in the area in which she lives and works, Sandra noted that there are very small apartments with extreme overcrowding, which is very different from the area she was in, because here in the sector, it is more historic buildings. There is also overcrowding, but they are very grand houses in which rooms are rented. In the apartments, I know of families living in 232 square meters where 12 people live. The buildings look pretty, they have a pool, an event hall, gym, but the overcrowding there is worse than the Haitian community who lives here in historic homes. Some with dirt floors and falling into disrepair. These options are equally bad. They are houses that were constructed thinking of profit and not of the quality of life, not of families, not thinking about the space for kids to play. They're thinking only in terms of maximizing the value of land. And Sandra's comment really gets at this kind of primary juxtaposition that you see oftentimes voiced both by Chileans and migrants of the kind of pattern settlement that you see with migrants, in which some migrants are living in high-rise apartments, particularly Venezuelans and Colombians in the center of town, and others are oftentimes kind of flows that started off earlier were living in older houses, historic houses that are subdivided by rooms. And the kind of conditions in each present certain complications in terms of overcrowding, and some of the conditions in the older houses have some particularly kind of detrimental. There's overcrowding, electrical problems. Some are quite humid and damp in the winter. That said, this is kind of definitely not a simple story, but it does reflect a general pattern that is noted both among Chileans and migrants. Just to take a quick step back, I was really interested and have written elsewhere about some of the ways that these settlements, the clusters of settlements, are really produced by exclusions and bureaucracy. Even when migrants have documents, as most migrants have either access to residence documents or are legally in the country, and I suspect Christian will talk a little bit about that. Even when they have access to documents, they face incredible barriers to accessing formal rental agreements. And oftentimes property owners ask for multiple months of upfront rent. They ask for demonstration of permanent residency. So your temporary residence can actually exclude you from being able to access formal rental agreements. They often ask for financial backers, Chilean bank accounts, work contracts, sometimes proof of deposits into healthcare and pension. So the kind of documentary and paper barriers to accessing housing are very real. One of the interesting things that is increasingly common, especially with the high-rise condos in Santiago, Independencia and Estación Central, so more middle class to lower middle class areas, the condos are oftentimes not primary residences and they're bought as investment properties. So the kind of rental market becomes quite competitive. In some ways, there's discussion of whether Chileans are being priced out because some of the migrants, particularly those from Venezuela with more access to resources, are able to outbid and kind of pay higher market rates. As mentioned, there's an incredible housing deficit. And then something I did not hear in interviews very much with Venezuelans, but definitely in several years of interviews with Peruvians, Colombians, and Dominicans was this notion of exclusion, discrimination, also limited access. And people would be told, oh, we don't rent to Peruvians or Colombians, et cetera. One of the kind of frameworks that people are really making use of is they're locating housing through social networks, which include both family networks and family connections, or friends of the family, friends of friends. There's also a kind of a number of social media communities in which people, through oftentimes national-based groups, find housing. And as the logics of making do and trying to find housing, even amid these challenges, play out, they kind of funnel migrants in into certain kind of housing arrangements. And the cumulative impact of this, I would argue, it kind of plays out in this way that Bayat describes as the quiet encroachment of the ordinary. That this is how the kind of these settlements kind of clusters are coalescing. So I want to share an ethnographic example of Katy and Julia, who are two friends, Venezuelans. So for many migrants, both in earlier flows of migration and in the kind of most recent Venezuelan arrivals, they mobilize social networks and familial connections to locate housing. Frequently, Venezuelan migrants report staying for a month or two in the living room of a family contact or friend from Venezuela before seeking their own place, which is oftentimes just a room or a shared room with someone else through a social contact. A week after I did an initial interview with Katy, I met up with her at one of the metro stops in Estación Central because she wanted to introduce me to friends who were interested in the research. She led me on a neighborhood tour, and she noted that the area, which is seen here, was still in development, but the presence of Venezuelan migrants made it easy to meet people. She showed me the bike repair store on the corner, and she noted that she'd been taking her bike there to fix a flat a couple weeks ago when she saw a friend from her hometown. Katy had not known that her friend was in Santiago, and she was delighted to learn that they were neighbors again. And that was who she brought me to meet, Julia. So we approached this kind of imposing high-rise block, and we fell in behind a couple of couples entering the building. The lobby was bustling, and we had to wait our turn to approach this kind of narrow entryway next to the attendant's desk. Katy said a cheerful hello and noted we were visiting a friend, and then she swept me right by the desk as the attendant was like simultaneously trying to field two other people's questions at the same time. There were three young men with food delivery backpacks who were guiding their bikes also through the kind of narrow entryway. And when we made it to the elevator, Kathy just shepherded me right on, kind of around a bike delivery employee. At the 12th floor, we slid around the biker and emerged in a long hallway. As Kathy knocked on her friend's door, she abruptly turned around with a worried expression on her face. And she said, "I need to warn you that it's just one small room." And having been in many of Santiago's new high-rise buildings, I assured her that this was not a surprise. The two young boys of the family, aged 9 and 5, were animatedly opened the door and welcomed us into the studio apartment. The space was approximately 6 meters by 6 meters, and half of the living space was taken up by queen-size mattresses piled on each other. Kathy's friend Julia explained that they have to pile things together during the day so that the boys have space to play. In the interview, Kathy noted that they were very fortunate to have found this place through an online ad. She said, quote, "They ask you for 2 months of a guarantee. They ask for 1 month in advance. They ask you for an infinite amount of money and requirements. And like everyone who had recently arrived, they ask for the last deposits or contributions. They ask you, in other words, another thing almost so that they don't have to rent to you," end quote. Kathy also chimed in with her story as we were talking. She said that she and 2 friends who had met on the journey to Chile had decided to look for a place together. After a week of disqualifications due to their limited resources, their lack of Chilean bank accounts, co-signers, and visas, they were put in touch with a Venezuelan property broker who strategized with them what documents could be used to establish legitimacy in the eyes of a property owner. With Kathy's certified university diploma, which was another hard-earned document, and 3 months of upfront rent lent to the trio by a brother who lives in Canada, the property broker was able to get them a compact 1-bedroom apartment. This negotiating of documents versus more months of upfront rent was commonplace. Several individuals I interviewed noted that in place of the requested documents, they had provided between 6 to 8 months of upfront rent, essentially handing over their reduced life savings to secure a place to live for several months. As the conversation wound down and Kathy cooked arepas, the boys eagerly pointed out all the apartments that displayed Venezuelan flags in the windows, and Julia noted that the block had about 28 floors with about 20 apartments per floor, and she estimated that 3/4 of the building's residents were Venezuelan. Later, as we left the apartment, Kathy stopped to point out all the Venezuelan products lining the shelves in the bodegas, including 4 brands of cornmeal for arepas and both Chilean and Venezuelan varieties of bread. This brief portrait of migrant experiences in high-rise apartments illustrates some of the ways that migrants make do with very confined and crowded confines. Daily rearranging of chairs and mattresses, utilizing every inch of possible storage, such as exposed terraces, preparing simple meals, shopping for food daily, coordinating bathroom schedules, making the most of waiting time at the elevator, and taking advantage of common areas and public spaces are all practices that frame the everyday rhythms of confined quarters. This example also highlights the multiple engagements with high-rise settlements, suggesting what might be missing from places which are often glossed as quote-unquote vertical ghettos, as their complex in particular is in the Chilean press. While Julia worried about the impact of the confined space on her young boys, Kathy shared how elevator small talk with fellow Venezuelans made her feel more at home in Chile. And while Kathy noted the exorbitant cost of having to pay 3 months of upfront rent in order to secure an apartment, Julia explained that the close quarters brought a couple of her floor's mothers together in an informal babysitting collaboration. Perhaps most importantly, the high concentration of Venezuelans in the neighborhood, paired with the limited paths of egress linking tower blocks to the main thoroughfare, allowed 2 friends from a small town thousands of miles away to reunite and reconnect. In interviews with the directors of 12 neighborhood councils in Santiago, in the central Santiago, the ways in which high-rise construction has changed the surrounding area was a recurring theme. All but one of the council directors had lived in the area for more than a decade, and many described how they had grown up in the area and what it had been like when they were children. For these directors, the change brought about by increasing verticalization is deeply felt. As Marisol shared, the biggest impact of the neighborhood has been the outcropping of condominiums. Because if I compare the neighborhood as it existed before, where there were many old, historic, large houses, they were patrimonial houses, and they have disappeared. They've disappeared. Then it was a neighborhood. It was just like a small town where everyone knew everyone. We all used to know everyone. Now it is more difficult. While the loss of the neighborhood as it was perceived to have been was frequently connected with increasing density, the council directors also regularly noted the ways in which they engaged with high-rise residents. Some councils had a representative in each of the towers in their sector, and several directors reported that they had increasingly been asked to rent out rooms, meeting rooms to people who wanted to host gatherings, including many migrants. The integration of high-rise residents into neighborhood activities was a common theme in the discussions with the council directors. Children participated in holiday celebrations, and the councils have taken on an increasingly important bureaucratic role, documenting migrant residences so that they may enroll kids in schools and seek medical services. Moreover, the possibilities of fostering social contacts between neighborhood residents, migrant and Chilean, was positioned as a new goal. Some of the councils coordinate weekly afternoon teas for seniors living in the neighborhoods, and directors noted that the participants now are oftentimes half Chilean and half Venezuelans. The limitations of small and typically shared apartments often prompt migrants to make use of quote unquote third spaces or sites away from home and work, which are vital to individual and community well-being. The use of public spaces and engagement with free activities was a common refrain in interviews with migrants, including Venezuelan migrants. In one poignant interview, an older man from Venezuela shared that in his hometown, security concerns had completely curtailed his use of public parks and even free movement on the streets. He reflected upon his own frequent use of a community library and local park as a return to how he remembered the possibilities of public space. In the months that followed, I often saw him in the library, and we would always chat and share our news before heading in separate ways. Similarly, I conducted many interviews at a large public community center, and several of the migrants noted that its central location, spaces for sitting and gathering, and free artwork had brought them to the center many times in the past. After one interview there, one woman walked me over to the city's information booth and made sure I got a listing of all the free tours offered each day. She was still applying for her visa documents and living with her adult son and his family, so she would choose a different tour to attend every day. She said that it was good for her to be outside walking. She had gotten to know the city and its history through the tours, and that she had already met several friends from the experiences. And as an added bonus, it got her out of her daughter-in-law's way for a couple hours every day. After another interview in a different part of a city, one woman walked me out of her building and insisted on showing me the church a block away from her son's apartment where she was staying. She led me around the different naves and alcoves of the church, explaining that it was her new home away from home, that she visited it daily, and that she had gotten to know well several of the regular attendees. From using parks and plazas to exploring bike trails, going on free tours, and participating in religious communities, migrants are routinely making use of myriad city spaces. The cumulative, albeit uncoordinated effect of these repetitive movements between migrants living in high-rise housing, particularly those living in high-rise housing, and key public spaces crafts links between urban verticality and the broader fabric of city life. So in conclusion, just a couple reflections on what I hope to continue exploring in my research. So the kind of first reflection is a discussion of a fluidity of the population in these central areas. Both Katia and Julia have since relocated from that high-rise apartment building, and many of the largely Peruvian migrants with whom I interviewed in 2013 and 2015 have likewise sought more comfortable accommodations further from the city center. The kind of high number of rental units, competition for housing, and mobility within the city suggests that these central sites, and particularly the high-rise apartment buildings, have a more ephemeral nature to them, a place to live for a little while, or a place to land and then move on from. And it begs the question of what will this mean for these neighborhoods in the future? The second point is that the increasing verticality and urban density kind of prompts an examination of how the trends are linked to, impact, and should be considered in light of the ways that people engage with public spaces, from sidewalks and walkways to plazas, parks, and community centers. And it kind of ends with the question of how are urban areas lived relationally? And what does increased and continued densification mean for the public spaces in those areas where these buildings are being sited? And then finally, perhaps most intriguingly, I'm really interested in the kind of migrant engagement with neighborhood centers. Many migrants are encountering the Junta de Vecinos in a first step to get documentation certifying their residence, which is a kind of new document that is oftentimes being requested. But that first step, getting into the Junta de Vecinos, oftentimes leads to recurring visits. There's been a lot of discussion in Santiago about intercultural engagement, and I find these sites to be a potential nexus between the kind of bureaucratic necessity, spatial incorporation in neighborhoods, and potential social encounters between migrants and Chileans. And I hope to be able to do longer term observational research at a couple of these sites, hopefully not in the all that distant future. So in summary, I find it useful to kind of continue to consider these reflections within Bayat's notion of the quiet encroachment of the ordinary, without setting out to change the face of the city, the cumulative outcome of migrants pursuing housing through any strategy that they can, and making do with overcrowding is transforming Santiago Center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheehan. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end. And now we are going to turn it over to Professor Doña Rebeco, who's going to be speaking about receiving context and policy changes in the transformation from emigration country to an immigration country, the case of Chile.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was looking forward to being in Milwaukee a few months ago for several reasons, in part because I was going to be able to vote in the Chilean election plebiscite, but that was postponed until a couple of weeks ago. So that sort of messed up with my planification. But again, COVID messed up with everyone's planification. It's somewhat something that I've been working for a long time, and at the same time that I haven't been working in a much larger of migration to Chile since 1990. And for now, I gave it this very grandiose title, receiving context and policy changes in the transformation from emigration country to an immigration country, because I'm trying to make sure that I put the time. So That's because a few years ago, and I mean, before 1990, Chile was still an immigration country. In fact, until a few years ago, there were more Chileans abroad than immigrants in Chile. So at some point in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, there was a flick on net migration and Chile became an immigration country. So, okay. Give me a second. There's one slide that I'm not seeing, and it's should be here. So all right, you can see it there. That's the slide that I'm missing for some odd reason in the actual presentation. The general context is that I've been trying to, for several years, to answer this question, or at least to think about this very large question on how do processes of nation-state construction influence on the immigrant perceptions, better said, on the perception of immigrants, and which founding myths and ideas of national identity explain acceptance or rejection of certain immigrant groups. I'm not going to talk about the entire thing. I'm just going to talk about the last 40 years, which in itself is a lot. And I'm going to focus on these three themes. 1, demographic change, 2, immigration policy, and 3, attitudes towards immigration. So let's talk about the receiving context. Throughout history, Chile has been seen itself as an exceptional country, and exceptional in the sense of different to all the surrounding countries. The mythical construction of the nation as the country that had the shortest anarchy period after the independence compared to all the countries in South America sort of gives origin to this idea of exceptionalism. The fact that it's an island, it was considered for many, many years an island in South America because you had to cross the desert, the Atacama Desert in the north, or cross the Andes. It made it sort of the even more exceptional. There was people in the early 1900s that called Chile the England of South America. So the Chileans were the British of South America. No, that's completely false. It's a myth. We all know that. And that idea of exceptionalism came back sort of at the end of the dictatorship, at the end of Pinochet dictatorships in 1990. And there's no better example than this iceberg that you see here on the on this slide. This is it's from 1992, is World Exposition in Seville in 92. So the dictatorship ended in 1991, 1990, and a couple of years later, so it was the Expo in Seville in 1992, the 500 years of the arrival of Columbus to what is now the Americas. And Chile, or the Chilean government, presented at that exposition an iceberg. They cut an iceberg from Antarctica. They cut it into pieces, they put it into boxes, they shipped it to Seville, and the goal was to keep it and to, they rearm it inside the Chilean place, and they sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. And the goal was to keep this iceberg in that place without melting. And I'm talking about the summer in Seville where temperature reaches the 90 to 100 Fahrenheit degrees. And that happened. And that was a very strong symbol that attempted to prove that Chile was open for business, and they could export one of its main exports at the time, fruit and vegetables, fresh to any part of the world in a very short time. And that at the same time, unlike it, so Chile is not a warm country, it's not a warm country, a colorful country. So unlike its neighbors, it was cool, calm, and open. That is probably to me it represents the main image that was that the government and society in some way attempted to show of what Chile is. At the same time, we're talking that because of its economic growth, because of its political tranquility, etc., Chile was called the Latin, or name itself as the Latin American Jaguar. This was in tigers that in the early 1990s were the economies that were growing the most in the world as a set of countries. There's directly affected Chile for several years, again, as a country that was different, that was more connected to East Asia growth than to its neighbors. And that is what, for many, attracted immigrants. It's a little bit more complex than that, but at least until October 18th of last year. That dream ceased to exist. That myth ceased to exist. And what you have here, the picture that I have here, is probably the most iconic. This is downtown Santiago, very close from where Megan was doing her research, and that is the protest, the largest protest in the history of the country against the government, but most importantly, against that economic model that existed since the end of the dictatorship and that has meant all this economic growth. Why is it people protesting economic growth, you will argue, you will ask? Because the economic growth on the last 30 years, it was only to a limited proportion of the population, and Chile at the same time is one of the most unequal countries in the Americas and in the world. So now there's, in the last year and a half, there's this whole discussion or last year of what is the new country, and immigrants are playing an important role in that discussion, and in this new Chile they'll come. All right, so very quickly, because Megan already talked a little bit about this, Chile, foreign-born population in Chile grew from 114,000 in 1992 to close to 1 million today. That is a massive growth. You can see the line here shows the annual average growth. So we have, there were times between 2017 and 2018 that the foreign-born population actually grew by 60%. And you know, the 15 years before that, it grew by 20%, 22%. That is a massive growth. It went from being 0.8% of the population of the country to being 8% of the population of the country today, right? So migration has become a presence that wasn't there 30 years ago. As Megan also pointed out, this has changed. There's been waves of migrants in terms of place of origin. The graph that you see, the table that you see here, is the proportion of migrants from a country according to the 2017 census, nation in 2018, and then the total number of migrants today. And this other part shows the rank of the immigrant country. So number 1 means that it was the most relevant in terms of numbers country in 1992, and number 15 is the least relevant country at the time in terms of immigration. We have Peru, so Argentina first. It's the neighbor country. 500,000 Chileans are in Argentina. That number one that existed for many years, it's a historical normality. And it's also part of returns of Chilean migrants with Argentinian children. So their children were born in Argentina to the country. So it's a little bit of an odd number. But we have still European countries. Spain was number 2 in 1992. And then we have Peru that quickly becomes the most important country. But look at Haiti. Before 2010, actually, there were no Haitians in Chile. In fact, according to in 2010, sorry, in the late 2000s, there were about 50 Haitians in Chile. I'm not saying 50 families, I'm not saying 50,000, I'm saying 50, 50, right? Today, we have 180,000. Right? So in the last 10 years, that population increased significantly. Same happened with the Venezuelan migration. That increased from, number 8. So, it was about 5,000 in 1992. Today is close to 500,000, right? Those are the two populations that have grown the most, but that shows how the different waves change. So you have Peru and Argentinians in the early 1990s, in the early 2000s, Ecuadorians about the same time, then Colombians, Cubans, and Dominicans, and now Haitians and Venezuelans as the largest groups. Because of a historical trend, Peru is still the largest, but in recent arrivals, it's not. 36, so a third of all Venezuelans in the country today between 2018 and 2019. Okay, so that's a large proportion. What about immigration policies? The early 1990s, we have sort of a first immigration law. It's called the law of return. It was, the idea was to welcome former exiles. So people that had left Chile for political reasons or impunity, now they were being welcomed back. And the law of return actually meant that these people returning were going to have the facility to import certain things, car, things they use at home, etc. And we're going to have an easy time converting their degrees that they obtained abroad into Chilean degree. Medicine abroad was going to be easier to turn it into a medicine degree in Chile. That is the only sort of migration law that existed at the time. There was an attempt to have another migration law in 1994. It never passed Congress. It just didn't happen. From that time on to 1995, we have an increasing migration. We have what several scholars on migration in Chile have called either the policy or no policy, or the state's frame of mind policy. What do we mean? What do they mean with this? The policy of no policy means that by migration policy, the state actually fulfill its own purpose of having a policy towards migration. So there's no intention of receiving migrants. In fact, the only law that exists today in Chile is the Law Decree 1094 from 1975. So it's about 45 years old. That is, it only states who gets a visa, what kind of visa they get, and for how long. That's it. There's no intent, there's no policy on who should we welcome, how should we welcome, what kind of rights are they giving when they arrive to the country. So by policy of no policy means the state didn't do anything because it was beneficial for the state to do nothing. The other argument of the frame of mind policy means that there were a few things, very small things, that either at the local or the national level were done in terms of policy, but quickly, as soon as the government changed or the major change in terms of political party, that policy disappeared. So there's not a concrete policy at all. We have what I've called the two doctrines of the last 10 years, 10 to 12 years. The Bachelet doctrine that through two presidential instructions, which are not binding, they don't have legal weight. She declared that Chile was a welcoming country. And in fact, it's during her government that we have a few actions, such as emergency medicine for undocumented migrants, for migrants in general, and emergency care for actually medical care for pregnant women, immigrant pregnant women, regardless of their immigration status. That doctrine ends in 2018, early 2018, with Piñera's cleaning up the house, where he develops a set of actions to actually try to, in his words, govern migration, but it means leaving out certain migrants from the country. It says we cannot accept migrants that come to be criminals to the country, or that they are falsifying their entry to the country, which is not true, not legally true, because the law allows people to enter as tourists and then change into a work visa or a student visa. So by this cleaning up the house, the Piñera government developed a new migration policy that is currently in Congress, and it's likely to pass in the next few months. A regularization process, a couple of new immigration visas that I'm going to talk in a few minutes, on top of the access to healthcare and access to education in some way, as Megan well pointed out very well. So there are a few actions, but it's not, Chile doesn't have a call-as immigration policy. And in terms of attitude towards immigration, there's this myth that Chile is a welcoming country. So we have the myth of exceptionalism as a national myth, but also the myth of a welcoming country. Early in the 1990s, a magazine said that the Chilean miracle attracted people because everywhere else in the region there was turmoil. There was political crisis, economic crisis. So the immigrants were in fact these passengers of the crisis that were coming to what other newspapers called the California of the South. And as other newspapers said, Chile was becoming more and more under siege by avalanches of immigrants. Were all migrants like this? No, but most. A survey in 1993 says, would you agree or disagree to the possibility of people from the following countries coming to live to Chile? And look at the differences. 54% of people said yes to Germans, but everywhere else, no. No to Chinese, more than half. No to Korean, more than half. 2/3 or close to 2/3 of no to Bolivians. Another 56% to Peruvian, and half to Argentinians. So exactly the countries that were coming, or the immigrants that were coming to Chile, were the one that were not liked. So that the welcoming country was only for some, mainly Germans, as we see in this survey. 30 years later, a survey in 2017 says that 15% of the people surveyed argue there is no conflict, and 46% argues there is little conflict. There's an overall positive and general attitude towards immigrants. This is in the people surveyed, and there's some things that I need to talk about that positivity. But when they're asked on the attributes of migrants that they feel they're strongly against, or at least that they react more when they meet an immigrant, is nationality, 2/3, and skin color, 60%. The Haitian population is Afro-descendant. A relevant proportion of Colombians are Afro-descendants, and that sort of brought back this idea of skin color. Now, another survey, 15 years apart, on attitudes to immigration in Chile actually shows that immigrants are more welcome, right? So it went from 57%, from 68 to 57 on whether the Chilean government should have more drastic measures against immigrants. 2 points on immigrants having the same rights, etc. So according to this, Chile is a welcoming country to immigrants. The government, however, the current government, because of the increase on Venezuelans and Haitians, created these two visas, the Democratic Responsibility Visa and the Humanitarian Visa. The first for Venezuelans, the second for Haitians. This meant that people from this country had to apply for a visa in the country of origin. And they were not allowed to enter Chile unless they had this visa. That meant that Haitians, the entry of Haitians decreased by about 70% in 1 year, and the Venezuelans a little bit less, by about 30%. Still, it stopped migration from the two, or reduced the speed of migration from the two most important sending countries. Now, today, the government also attempted to send back migrants through return flights, humanitarian return flights, that originally, if you chose to take one of these flights back to Haiti mostly, you were not allowed to enter the country for 10 years, to come back to Chile for 10 years. That was overruled by the courts about a couple of months ago. So the government is against immigrants, at least the current government, or in general, the whatever we can call of immigration policy has been mostly against immigration, but at least we see that people are more pro-immigrants. That change of attitude is something that we need to study more because it doesn't make sense. To me, it's simply that people, similar to what happened here, in surveys are saying, when they're really, because it's bad, they don't want to seem that they don't like immigrants. But there's something, a lot of things that we need to unpack from that, and we need to do more research. And I close with this. I mentioned the political crisis of the last year that began with the October 2018 protests. In the next 2 years, there's going to be about 10 elections or more in Chile. There's an economic crisis because of that political crisis, and that was made even worse by COVID. And now we have a health crisis. So this panorama of migration to Chile is up in the air. There's been some return, but not a lot. There's been some entry, some undocumented migrants, an increase in undocumented migration because of the change in the visas. So we don't know what's really going to happen. And in all, Chile has 8% of its population born in a different country, which has never happened in the history of the country. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. So any questions, please put them in the chat. And I've got a couple of questions while we're waiting for other people to type some up. First of all, Megan, I had a quick question for you about, I know you had done work in the past with Peruvians and more recently with Venezuelans, and I'm wondering if you had a sense of how those groups are perceived in Chile. For example, in Ecuador, they often spoke of the people coming from Colombia as like sharing a lot of cultural traits and they're like brothers. And so I wondered if like the geographical proximity of Peru, or was it more equality in socioeconomic status with the Venezuelans? Just wondering if you noticed any differences in how the groups are perceived.
Yeah, I'll offer my take, and then I'm curious to hear Christian's as well. The Peruvian migration was kind of really stigmatized, right? And even when I did interviews with Peruvian, so it's both stigmatized and racialized, which I did not get into, but have written on. And the Venezuelan migration, it really caught my attention this last time when I went back, because there had been such a kind of abrupt and significant change. And for instance, something simple like I have a manuscript about riding on mass transit. And for many Peruvian research participants, I had to go along with them, and then they'd stop talking to me when we got on the subway or boarded a bus because they didn't want to be out. They didn't want people to hear their accent. And it was such a odd experience to be out in walking around Santiago and hear people just openly talking about their experiences as Venezuelan migrants and not having to hide that. Oftentimes I think the Venezuelan migration is associated with professionals. And so people often have this narrative, which doesn't always map to reality, but this idea that, oh, the Venezuelans are coming here and they're undercutting our salaries, but they're professionals and they're bringing some education and kind of skills that we need in Chile. I also think that I heard a lot of discussions about the connection between Venezuela for taking in Chilean immigrants in the 70s and having some kind of seeing the current migration in that aspect as well. I don't know, Christian, if you have more to.
So that's what Megan was explaining is exactly why I think that the survey data, it's odd, because the qualitative data shows something completely different. My hypothesis is that the immigrant that those who are surveyed have in their minds is the European immigrant of the past and not necessarily the recent immigrant. So that's on one side. The Venezuelan migration was seen until recently as a ideal migration in some way. Exactly, they were professionals, they were political refugees, although not legally refugees, but they were seen as political refugees. Venezuela was one of the largest countries, one of the countries that received the largest amount of exiles from the Pinochet era. Isabel Allende, the writer, spent her first years in exile in Venezuela as many other Chileans. And in fact, a few, I don't have numbers, but of the early Venezuelans that arrived in Chile were descendants of Chilean exiles, or at least, partially. So there was that idea. I've been told in a few interviews that I've done and talking with other people that that is changing. I have a paper on a policy aspect of that, but that is changing because the new Venezuelan immigrants are poorer. They're not professionals. It's a difference. If they come by bus, they're not welcome. If they come by plane, they are. It's income, right? So yeah, there's that tension between being Peruvian versus being Venezuelan, but it's also changing within Venezuelans. Just very quickly, in the case of Haitians, it also had a similar. It moved from we're welcoming the poorest people from the poorest country in the Americas that suffered a huge earthquake at about the same time that Chile suffered an earthquake. It was disastrous for them. We didn't feel it. But then when the number increased significantly, it was, no, we don't want this Black people in the country anymore. Very racialized. So that is sort of the tensions in the country, I would say.
Thank you. And we see the same thing in Ecuador too, with migrants coming from Haiti and also from sub-Saharan Africa as well. There's growing numbers. Now there's a question in the chat for both of you. Has there been any attempt to address the issue of rental discrimination in Santiago and elsewhere in Chile, and are local governments aware of the issue?
Go for it.
I guess one small thing, and Megan knows more about this. Until very recently, migrants were not allowed to apply to a rental subsidy. That made it really, really difficult for them to rent, and they had to wait about 5 years. So it was difficult. The government just changed that. I don't know, very recently. Megan probably knows more about that. And that was my part. Megan, I think you know more about this.
I'll just say that the rental law is eerily reminiscent of the migratory law, and that both were written under Pinochet and have this very much the property owner can ask for almost anything that they want. The two kind of caveats are that I think they can only raise the rent like, or charge per year, like 11% of the total value of the unit. And I think it has to be finished. Like you can't rent partially finished. But my understanding is that there were more rental protections pre Pinochet era, and that the kind of laws were rewritten. It seems like very kind of neoliberal housing market. And actually it's not only Chilean property owners, there are oftentimes migrants who will rent out a space and then sub-rent in a similar style. And I think local governments seem aware of it. And the rental subsidies has been, I went to a couple workshops on rental subsidies, and it seems like they're trying to get the word out because not that many people are actually applying, even if that's like an option now. But I'm not sure that there's that much that can be done. So.
Thank you. We've only got about 4 minutes. I have a question for Christian as well. It's probably a big question. Do what you can do with it in about 3 minutes. But you had mentioned this perception of like Chile being an island, and your interest in perceptions of immigration, like in the process of, I think you were saying, nation building. Do you think there was ever a sense of like this island perspective then gave them geographic protection from immigration? Or were they more interested in opening up when you mentioned that about with the iceberg thing and Chile is open in the early 90s? I just didn't know if that island mentality had anything to do with how open they might have thought they were to immigrants.
No, the island mentality and the openness of the Chilean country, let's say, in the 1990s, it's more a commercial openness. It's not a welcoming to immigrants particularly. Again, the welcome migrant is the German migrant that came in the 1870s. In fact, there's one of my projects is to compare the media, the newspapers from that era till now. I have some from that era. Some of them are not very flattering for immigrants. Actually, they're very critical of immigrants, of German immigrants. But there's, but that's another story. So the openness is the commercial openness, not any other. Open for business, actually. That's how many authors have presented it.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we're about out of time, so I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and thank our hosts again. And this webinar will be available. It's being recorded. So if you missed something or want to share it with friends, please contact the hosts. And thank you very much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anne, for organizing or moderating.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Terrific conversation, and it's so nice to get the South to South perspective in our series. And so I thank everyone for joining us, and thank all the participants for joining us as well. I hope everyone has a terrific evening. And thank you.